Hello biology students, and welcome to Unit 4, where we're going to be talking all about the cell. So this unit's going to be split into two pieces, and the first piece is going to be all about what the cell looks like, so its structure, and it's the cell's function, so all the jobs the different parts of the cell do. So before we actually get into it, it took several centuries for cells to be discovered, and then, basic laws and rules about the cell to be decided on by scientists. So first, a scientist by the name of Hooke, he was the first one to observe cells and name them cells. So this happened in 1665. And Hooke, when he was looking at the microscope at cork cells, what he saw were a bunch of boxes. They kind of look like this. Okay, and these reminded him of the rooms that monks slept in monasteries, and those were called cells, so he also called the things he was viewing as cells. About 10 years later, von Leeuwenhoek was the first one to observe that cells were living, because cork was just like the dead outer part of a tree, of the cork tree, when Hooke was looking at them, so those weren't living cells. And then about 60 years later, a scientist by the name of Brown was the first one to see a structure inside the cell. So he saw that near the center of the cell there was this dark structure that he called the nucleus. In the late 1830s, two scientists, whose names are very fun to say, Schleiden and Schwann, stated that all plants and all animals are composed of cells. So Schleiden, he's the one who said that all plants are composed of cells, and Schwann said that all animals are composed of cells. And I remember this because Schwann kind of sounds like swan, and swans are animals. And then finally, in the late 1850s, Virchow concluded that cells only come from other cells. So cells divide to form new cells. So the findings of these scientists were put together into what is known now as the cell theory. So the first part of the cell theory says that the cell is the basic unit and structure and function of living things, that all living things are composed of cells, and that all cells must come from other cells. So pretty basic. So some interesting things about cells. They range wildly in size. So for example, if we look at the smallest cells we know are very tiny bacteria. And they're on the range of about 100 nanometers, so very, very tiny. Where we can get a single cell, like technically a chicken egg is also a single cell, and that's 1/10 of a meter. So we have a huge range in how big cells can be. They also have wildly different shapes. So you can see, this kind of flattened circle, that's a red blood cell. These are some plant cells. You can see they're more square in shape. You can see over here, I assume this is a nerve cell. It has a very different shape. Okay, so cells have very different shapes. And they also have different organization. And the main two ways cells can be organized is that they can either be prokaryotic or eukaryotic. So let's talk about these words. So prokaryotic cells, these are the simplest cells. They're very small, okay? And the only cells that are prokaryotic are things like bacteria and also archaea. Archaea are kind of similar to bacteria, but they live and survive in very extreme conditions, places like in hot springs and things like that. They're very simple cells. So prokaryotic cells have no nucleus, and they have no membrane-bound organelles. So they have some organelles, but none of their organelles have membranes. Because they have no nucleus to hold their DNA is instead found in what we call the nucleoid region, and they usually have a cell wall. So here's a picture of bacteria. So you can see the DNA just in the cytoplasm of the cell, and it's in this region we call the nucleoid. It has some organelles, like these ribosomes here, but those ribosomes don't have membranes. It has a cell wall, this layer right here, and overall it's a very small and simple cell. So contrastingly, eukaryotic cells are much larger and much more complex than prokaryotic cells. A eukaryotic cell is defined as having a nucleus, okay? So if you have a nucleus, you are automatically a eukaryotic cell. They also have organelles that have membranes, okay? And most forms of life on the planet are eukaryotic. So any fungi, any protists, so things like amoeba, any animals, any plants are all eukaryotic. So here's an example of a eukaryotic cell. Specifically, this is an animal cell. So you can see this is much more complicated than the prokaryotic cell we were looking at. We see a nucleus where the DNA is held, and then there are all these membrane-bound organelles. So all these organelles that have membranes. So it's a much, much more complicated situation. So here is a plant cell, which is also eukaryotic, and you see it's equally complex as the animal cell. Okay, so if we were going to compare prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, prokaryotes have no nucleus, eukaryotes have a nucleus. However, it's important to know that even though the prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, they still have DNA. So both cell types have DNA. Prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles, and eukaryotes do. And then examples of prokaryotes are bacteria and archaea. And then basically everything else is eukaryotic. Okay, so I mentioned this word a bunch, and I know you've seen it in the previous science classes, but just to remind you, organelles, so what they are, they're little defined bodies, so they're little sections of cells that perform specialized tasks. Now, most of them have membranes, and this is actually very important that they have membranes, because the membranes allow for something we call compartmentalization. So we form different compartments within the cell, okay? And this is kind of important, because you can kind of imagine if I have different compartments or different sections, it means different things can be happening in the cell in different places. If there were no compartments, it would be hard to do different things at the same time, because, all the different tasks would be mixed up. So this allows the cell to carry out a variety of different activities at the same time. So, having organelles is pretty important for higher order functioning. So if we were going to look at all cells, so by all cells I mean both prokaryotes and eukaryotes, what do they all have in common? So they all have a plasma or cell membrane. That's two words for the same thing. They all have a cytoplasm. They all have DNA, and they all have ribosomes. I have a little asterisk here. Red blood cells in your body, they start out by having a nucleus and DNA, but they do eventually lose them. They do eventually lose their nucleus. So technically, they have lost their DNA, but because they had it at one point, they're still considered to be a cell. So let's break down these four things. So the first one, the cell or plasma membrane. So this is found in all cells, and we've talked about this already a little bit. So here's a picture of the cell membrane. So its job is to separate the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. It's semi-permeable, which means that only some things can get in and out. So it's kind of like the gatekeeper. It decides what enters the cell and what exits the cell. We already know from last unit that it's a phospholipid bilayer, right? There's 2 layers of phospholipids that make up the plasma membrane. And we also said that it can be described using what's called the fluid mosaic model. So fluid here means liquid, and mosaic means having many pieces. So basically there are many pieces of the cell membrane that kind of move around as if they were liquid. So let's look at another picture to help us understand that. So here's in reality more of what the cell membrane looks like. This is in actuality more of what it looks like. So you can see I have my phospholipid bilayer, but I also have some proteins that are embedded in there. I have cholesterol that's embedded in there, and all these pieces are moving. So maybe this cholesterol is right here in this second, but it might, move over here later. It might move amongst the phospholipids. So that's why we call it the fluid mosaic model, because all the pieces of the mosaic can move fluidly throughout the membrane. So the second piece that all cells have is called the cytoplasm. This is basically the background material of the cell. It's basically where all the water is, all the minerals, all the nutrients, so that reactions can happen. And what it is, it's the aqueous solution, or the water-based solution that's inside the cell membrane that encompasses or surrounds all the organelles except for the nucleus. Okay? So it's basically the liquid that's holding all the organelles and has all the materials for all the reactions. You might see the vocab word cytosol. Cytosol is very similar to the cytoplasm, but it's just the solution. It's kind of like the cytoplasm, it's the solution and everything in it, and the cytosol is just the solution itself. The third thing that all cells have in common is DNA. Now, DNA is not an organelle, okay? But it is common amongst all cells. And we already know that DNA is the molecule that stores and transmits our genetic information. It actually contains all of the information we need to make proteins, and it's copied and given to new cells when cells replicate. And we already know its structure is a double helix. We saw this in the last unit. And then finally, the fourth thing that all cells have in common are ribosomes. Okay, so ribosomes, their function is to link amino acids together. AA stands for amino acid. Basically, ribosomes, their job is to build proteins, okay? Because we know by linking amino acids together, we're going to be building a protein. Their structure, they are an enzyme, okay? And as an enzyme, we know all enzymes are made of protein, but they also actually have some RNA in their structure, which is a little bit strange. They are the only, or not the only, one of the only organelles that is not membrane bound. So it has no membrane, which makes sense because we know it's found in prokaryotes, and prokaryotes don't have membrane bound organelles. And it can be found in two places. It can be found just floating around in the cytoplasm, or it could be found attached to what we call the rough ER, which is abbreviated RER, and that stands for rough endoplasmic reticulum. And we'll see that more later in the next video. Okay, so this is what a ribosome actually looks like. So you can see it's made of two pieces. Each of these pieces are made of both protein and RNA, and they associate together to form this, which is what a ribosome looks like. And here is an actual microscope picture of a ribosome. So you can see, even if you zoom way in, they kind of just look like black circles. So that's it. That's video 1, and I'll see you in video 2.